Suffering should never be a choice. Unfortunately for many, the heart is the last level of priority. Recognizing greed and fear can lead one to a happier state of being. A deeper joy can emerge because it is given room to play. It's only the ego that tries to dictate unhappiness as a solution. Such unhappiness is projected to give importance to a title of some sort. That title should be on the last level of priority because of what it does to the heart, how it seems to cloud the possibility of silliness to shine. Smiling is a good first step. Moving without a plan is a very bold step, but the aliveness is there. The freshness is there. It should be a ritual to break routine whenever possible. You are life, not a repetitive machine. Although repetition can be helpful in certain situations, recognizing that each repetition is a new event all in its own helps to bring the awareness to the freshness of reality. You are intelligence, not a software program. Spontaneity is a friendly gesture to all of creation. It is an invitation for creativity to flow on its own accord. Tomorrow isn't here. It's never here. What is here is the unchanging opportunity to live. To acknowledge being alive. To play with existence, not intangible projections that support roles and titles. Those are just stories. Needed completion of tasks can occur more freely without those aggressive concepts. Nobody can play hard. That is a facade of the ego, who would have one work to death and imagine that something else has occurred. Everything built up in this world changes hands eventually. Let it go for a bit and check in with your heart. Go that way for an hour and see how you feel. It doesn't take work to earn play. One can play with work also. It's not a bad thing to simplify the undesirable and engage creativity. Nobody is a sterile scientific machine. Let your heart teach you where to move. Then follow it. That's your path. It leads you where you are supposed to be. The difficulty emerges when an identity gets mixed in with that intuitive spontaneity. Then the agendas begin to form, and then the attention is placed back into the projections in the mind. The heart is, at that point, clouded by projections, masked, hidden by projections. And yet these emotions that get mixed in with the agenda for the egoic mind, the egoic identity, they're never whole. There's always some feeling of something missing in those emotions. Because the egoic identity wants to claim those emotions as its emotions, when in reality it's just the consciousness of creation spontaneously, we can say, unfolding. This is also the will of God. Your body is an expression of something higher. Your soul isn't just something tiny contained inside your body and locked away inside your body. It's actually something opposite of that, in a way. But to say that the soul is an object that you have, that's where it can get a little bit tricky for the mind only. But if there's an identity there, that needs to get somewhere in the future, a question to ask intelligently is, why is that somewhere in the future so important? But not to give your full attention to it, just to see from where you are looking already in your inner perception, just to see that whatever projection is emerging somehow doesn't feel as good as the present moment does. It doesn't feel as alive. That's where that sense of lack comes from. But when the mind continues to build on such concepts as the egoic identity in its center of the story, it takes these ideas and says that the feeling that is accompanying them, the emotion of lack that's there, is because the future isn't here yet. And that makes it feel so much more important. But in reality, that isn't the way that things are unfolding. In reality, what's happening is the attention has moved away from the present moment and onto some projection. That simplicity of movement is the very cause of that feeling of lack to begin emerging. So it's at that point where one must bring awareness into what's happening in that whole dynamic process, that dynamic part of consciousness, and utilize from intelligence the awareness, the light of consciousness that sees that dynamic happening inside, and take a step back from it, meaning withdraw the attention from it as though there's not any recourse of action needed beyond withdrawing attention from it. Why do I state it like this? Because if there's a resistance that's brought into that, as though that whole dynamic is not the way to go, then that's just another kind of egoic identity sort of slipping in the back door, trying to take the position of saying, I'm you, I'm the one that's right, and that activity is wrong. So that's not really stepping out of that as far as the attention's placement is concerned. Withdrawing the attention from all activity that the mind would present is not really a kind of doing. That's what makes it seem difficult for the mind, because the mind wants to hold on to that egoic identity, because that's its nature. That's its conditioned nature. That's not its essential nature. But that whole dynamic isn't present in deep sleep. And we can look at that and ask why. Why isn't it present during deep sleep? That's because that whole seeking function, in other words, that level of intelligence which is consciously moving the direction of attention, holding the attention, it's at rest. That's where the letting go happens. That's where the meaning of surrender really begins to unfold. It has nothing to do with surrendering your objects and other attachments out in the physical world. That is a byproduct in a way, but it has nothing to do with that in the primary level of release, surrender. Surrender is what allows us to exit from the projections in the mind. There's a scripture in the Bible that says to take every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. How do you do that? Well, you have to first be embodying a purer place than the place where thinking is occurring. That's not another layer of the mind watching the mind. This is a deeper level of consciousness that the mind can't access. It's where you're looking from, inside. Your perception is occurring at that source of expression in the higher consciousness, which we could say is God's will unfolding in this present moment. Surrender allows us to get out of that mode of, I need this and I've got to get that, and I, me, my, got to get this, got to get that, got to do this, got to get, got to do, got to get, got to do, got to get, got to do. Because, why? The same because is always the undercurrent of this dynamic. And this because is because there's this feeling of lack. once you see the feeling of lack, that can be a clue to say, who is making these projections in the mind? Is it really where I'm looking from, or is it just some conditioning of survival that the world is seeming to be needed for importance of that one's agenda? Once you can exit out of the mode of consciousness that's not needed for this present moment, you can see that the practicality of the mind is still available as needed. It isn't something that just vanishes and it's gone for good, and there's all this egoic fear, which is false, but it seems real because there's a fear that something's going to get lost if surrender happens. Oh no. But that isn't really how it unfolds at all. When one is able to step away from the mind and just let the silence of restful perception occur, then from that place of clear, open awareness, the heart can be much more easily nurtured. There's a scripture in the Bible that says that the heart is desperately wicked, desperately wicked. Above all things, who can know it? There's a question in that verse. The one that can know it is the one who's been able to let go of enough of the chatter of the ego to actually look at the heart and see what it needs. How many weeds are growing in that garden that need to be focused upon? Grace will clean out a lot of that all on its own. But first, there has to be an opening, an invitation for grace to come in and do that work. And that's when all of the problems that had access to damaging the heart, making it desperately wicked, as the scripture says, that's when that part of the heart, which is the spiritual heart, can not only be accessed at that point, but healed. One key factor in that whole evolution of letting go of the mind and reaching the depth of the heart, so that all of the pain that that mental identity was causing based on all the lack that it was projecting, it can be healed at that point. It can be healed not only on the human level, but deeper within the experience, from a purer place and into a purer place. There's work to be done purifying. And this purification process is known as sanctification. This is the real meaning of sanctification. It isn't about becoming a better person and keeping a good record on how many times you've attended church. That helps. But it helps in kind of a passive way. It helps in a way that One's morale is boosted by waking up early and maybe getting some breakfast and dressing nicely and going to meet with people that are loved in an atmosphere that's filled with focus on scriptures. But the depth of those scriptures can't be reached if that judge who's sitting in the seat in the mind, that identity who's right, always right, if that one's still there, there's no escaping the damage that follows, because the attention is still involved in a way in that whole movement. And that's why it's important to remember the scripture that says you reap what you sow. Where you are sowing doesn't matter so much to the world. The world may say that it matters a lot. Please help this cause. Please help that cause. Please do this. There's a need for that. There's a need for that. Those are okay. Good works are not a problem. But the sowing that's happening is where the attention is placed. That's where the real and the deepest part of sowing and reaping is in its primary level of existence. When we notice where our attention is, we have the intelligence to do this, no problem. It's effortless to notice where the attention is. We're just simply observing. But when we become aware that we can observe the attention, that's the moment we realize our intelligence is deeper than the mind, because we can place our attention on thoughts in the mind, and we can place the attention on the joy that's underneath all of those scars from the situation that the mind caused, where this victim identity who's always lacking and needs something so much greater in the future, where that whole dynamic has been happening, there's a joy underneath all of that that's been buried under that garbage. It hasn't gone anywhere, but because the mind has continually been saying, later, later, I've got to get this and be this and become this later. That's where this feeling of lack is coming, and that lack is what's been piled on top of this joy. There's a joy, a wellspring of joy underneath all of that never ever leaves. One need only stop engaging all of that traffic in the mind in order to allow the consciousness, which is deeper than the mind, to see that withdrawing the attention from that, there's a relaxation that happens. There's kind of a dropping into the heart space that happens. And once this really truly occurs, once this is really truly experienced, not just by knowing that it happens that way, but actually experiencing that release, then one can see that that's where one has been looking from the whole time. But because the identity in the mind has been believed, people are living in their heads thinking that that's their center. Of course it isn't. But that can only be met